My daughter was the one who called me, and I could hear in her voice, before she'd even finished the first sentence, that something had genuinely frightened her. She was 12 years old, standing near our old fishing pond with her younger brother, and her voice was shaking in a way I hadn't heard since she was much smaller. "Dad," she said, "there's a lady here. She says we're trespassing. She says she's calling the police." That pond sits about 400 yards behind our house, on land my family has owned, outright, recorded, and paid for since 1985, and my grandfather's before that since 1946. My children were not trespassing. They were standing on ground their own grandfather had cleared with a borrowed tractor before either of them was ever born. My name is Walton Kessler. I'm 61 years old, and I own 210 acres of pasture, hardwood forest, and a spring-fed pond in a rural stretch of countryside that had, over the previous 12 years, slowly become surrounded by a gated development called Ashford Meadows. I got in my truck before my daughter had even finished explaining, and the 6-minute drive out to that pond felt like the longest drive of my entire life. I need to go back further, because to understand why a woman felt confident enough to threaten 2 children with a trespassing charge on land my family had owned for 4 decades, you have to understand how a subdivision grew up around us without anyone bothering to ask an honest question about the property lines they were building against. My grandfather, Otto Kessler, bought the original core of this land in 1946, returning from the war with a wounded leg, a modest disability pension, and a determination to build something permanent out of ground nobody else particularly wanted. He cleared it slowly over decades, and around 1951 he found a natural spring seep on the eastern edge of the property and spent nearly 2 years expanding it, by hand, into the pond that still sits there today. My father, Otis, inherited the core acreage in 1971 and added 2 more parcels over the following years, bringing the total to 210 acres, all properly recorded with the county at every single step. I inherited the whole property outright in 1985, at 31 years old, following my father's sudden death from a heart attack at just 59. Ashford Meadows broke ground in 2012, built on a neighboring farm that had finally become unsustainable for the family that owned it. I had no objection to the development itself. My only concern from the beginning was making sure the surveyors respected the recorded boundary between my land and theirs, a boundary my father had walked and confirmed decades earlier. That boundary was properly surveyed on paper. What developed over the following years wasn't a legal dispute over where the line sat. It was something slower and more deliberate, a persistent, calculated pressure campaign aimed at wearing down exactly that boundary until it stopped mattering. I met Vanessa Holloway roughly 4 years before the incident at the pond, not long after she became president of the Ashford Meadows Homeowners Association. She drove up my gravel drive one afternoon to introduce herself and mentioned, almost in passing, that my pond specifically would make a wonderful addition to the community's amenity package, asking whether I'd be open to what she called a community access arrangement. I told her plainly that the land wasn't for sale, and I had no interest in any shared arrangement. She smiled the particular smile of someone who has decided your answer today doesn't need to be your answer forever, and told me she simply wanted to keep the lines of communication open. I want you to remember that phrase, because everything Vanessa Holloway did over the following 4 years moved steadily toward the same unstated goal she'd revealed in that very first conversation. The pattern of small encroachments began within 6 months. I discovered a section of my grandfather's original cedar fence quietly replaced with a decorative wrought iron fence extending 15 feet onto my side of the line, installed by an Ashford Meadows landscaping crew without a word of notice. It took 3 months and 2 follow-up calls before it was moved back. About 8 months later, I found survey stakes along my northern edge, and learned from the surveying company itself that Ashford Meadows had commissioned a preliminary study for a walking trail extension connecting to, in the survey company's own paperwork, the natural water feature adjoining the property, my grandfather's pond, described in an official document as though it existed in some ambiguous, unclaimed space. I confronted Vanessa, who explained that the association's planning committee saw the pond as an amenity opportunity and mentioned a mutually beneficial easement the board intended to formally propose eventually. I told her no such arrangement would ever be forthcoming, and the stakes disappeared within the week. That was the moment I stopped believing these were honest mistakes. I began keeping a formal log after that, dating every letter and every incident, a habit that would eventually fill 3 thick binders. Roughly 18 months later came a letter citing potential agricultural runoff contamination from my property, demanding a formal environmental assessment. My cattle herd had shrunk to 12 animals kept mostly out of habit, and the County Agricultural Extension Office confirmed no complaint had ever crossed their desk regarding my land. I retained an attorney, a careful man named Gideon Marsh who'd handled my family's affairs for 2 decades, and his response made clear the association possessed no authority whatsoever to compel any assessment on land outside its own boundary. The letters stopped for nearly a year, and I allowed myself to believe Vanessa had accepted the settled reality of my boundary. I was wrong. A resident named Cordelia Prout, who'd served briefly on the Architectural Review Committee before resigning in frustration, reached out to me directly one afternoon. "Vanessa's been talking about your land in board meetings for years," she told me, sitting on my porch. "Always framing your resistance as a temporary obstacle rather than a settled fact. There was a private planning session about 8 months ago that never appeared on any public agenda. I overheard part of it through an open window. She called it long-term acquisition strategy regarding what she referred to as the Kessler Holdout." The Kessler Holdout. I sat with that phrase for a long time because it confirmed what I'd suspected for years. This wasn't a series of misunderstandings. It was a deliberate, sustained campaign conducted partly outside any properly documented board process, aimed at eventually acquiring my family's land through whatever combination of pressure and incremental encroachment might eventually wear me down. I also learned, around this same time, that I wasn't the only long-time landowner experiencing this pattern. A neighbor named Percival Landry, who owned 40 acres along the development's eastern edge, approached me at a community fundraiser to ask whether Ashford Meadows had ever pressured me about my boundaries in a way that felt more persistent than it should. His own experience, a drainage easement request, a shared retention pond obligation he'd never signed onto, and a scenic buffer letter restricting what he could build, confirmed that Vanessa's campaign extended well beyond my own property alone, adjusted individually based on what she perceived as each landowner's particular vulnerabilities. I discovered one more incident that troubled me considerably, roughly 2.5 years before the pond confrontation. A small decorative bench and interpretive sign installed 20 feet onto my northern boundary, describing an Ashford Meadows heritage overlook preserved. The sign claimed, in partnership with neighboring landowners. I had entered into no such partnership. Gideon's letter got it removed within 10 days, though it had already stood for 6 weeks by the time I found it, long enough for an unknown number of residents to read and absorb exactly the false understanding it had been designed to create. I want to return to that afternoon at the pond. When I arrived, I found Vanessa Holloway standing near the water in an expensive outdoor jacket entirely unsuited to actual labor. Her phone held up recording video of my 2 frightened children. "Mr. Kessler," she said, shifting into the same practiced tone from our first conversation 4 years earlier. "I found your children trespassing on Ashford Meadows conservation land. I've already contacted the sheriff's department." "This is my land," I said. "It has been since 1985 and my grandfather's before that since 1946. My children are not trespassing. Show me this conservation easement documentation right now, or leave my property immediately." She did not show me any documentation, because none existed. She kept recording instead, apparently hoping to capture footage of me reacting aggressively to what she would later characterize as a concerned resident protecting community land. Two sheriff's deputies arrived roughly 15 minutes later, a younger deputy and a senior sergeant named Dolores Whitfield, who I'd known casually for years. Vanessa gave her account first: unauthorized minors trespassing on protected conservation land. When it was my turn, I retrieved from my truck the first of my 3 binders: the 1985 deed, my father's 1962 and 1968 purchase records, and the recorded county plat map showing my boundary running well clear of any conservation easement, because none had ever existed on any properly recorded document anywhere in the county. Sergeant Whitfield reviewed it carefully. "Mr. Kessler, this appears to be your recorded property. Ma'am, do you have any documentation supporting a conservation easement claim?" Vanessa did not, and her answer retreated into vague references to internal planning materials and long-standing community understanding, language that satisfied nobody standing at that pond, least of all the sergeant, who informed her plainly that no trespassing charge could possibly be pursued against children standing lawfully on their own family's land. I want to be honest that the humiliation at the pond did not end the situation. Within 3 days, an attorney representing the association sent a considerably more aggressive letter, alleging a pattern of unauthorized incursion by my children, and demanding I install a physical barrier along what it called a disputed boundary area. There was no disputed boundary. Gideon's response made that unambiguous, and put the association on formal notice that we intended to pursue our own legal action if the pattern continued. Gideon and I filed a formal quiet title action, not because there was any genuine ambiguity about ownership, but because I'd concluded that nothing short of a permanently binding court ruling would ever stop Vanessa Holloway from simply waiting a season before resuming her campaign. The filing, once part of the public record, prompted several board members, once they understood its full scope, to start asking their own pointed questions. A board member named Terrence Whitlock reached out to Gideon directly, explaining he'd grown uncomfortable for years with Vanessa's persistent focus on my property, always assuming it reflected some legitimate documented interest rather than an unfounded personal campaign. The hearings unfolded over several sessions across nearly 4 months. The first established the complete, unbroken chain of title: my grandfather's 1946 purchase, my father's 1962 and 1968 acquisitions, and my own 1985 inheritance, cross-referenced against the county's plat map showing no easement had ever existed. The association's attorney attempted to argue a prescriptive claim based on years of informal community understanding, an argument Gideon dismantled easily, since every single documented incident had been challenged and corrected within weeks, precisely the opposite of the unchallenged, continuous use a prescriptive claim requires. The second hearing focused on the pond incident itself. Sergeant Whitfield testified that Vanessa had produced no documentation at the scene. Cordelia Pruitt testified about the overheard planning session and the phrase Kessler Holdout. Terrence Whitlock confirmed he'd never once seen legitimate documentation despite repeatedly asking for it. And Percival Landry testified to his own parallel experience, establishing the broader pattern beyond my property alone. When Gideon asked Vanessa directly whether she'd informed her own board of her private planning discussions, her answer offered nothing beyond an admission that she'd believed strongly enough in the community's eventual claim to act before what she called the paperwork caught up with the outcome she considered inevitable. The final hearing brought the complete 4-year pattern together in one place, and Gideon closed with a document produced during discovery, internal committee notes in Vanessa's own handwriting confirming the acquisition strategy, including one line he read aloud slowly for the record. Patience will eventually resolve the Kessler situation in the community's favor. Judge Prudence Ake's ruling left no ambiguity. My family's ownership of the full 210 acres was formally and permanently affirmed, with the court specifically finding that Vanessa Holloway had engaged in a sustained, documented pattern of encroachment and harassment, culminating in a legally baseless threat of criminal charges against minor children. The Ashford Meadows board voted unanimously to remove Vanessa from the presidency once the ruling became public. Cordelia Prout was elected to fill the vacancy, and one of her first acts, alongside Terrence, was commissioning an independent review of every boundary claim the association had ever made, a review that found no similarly unfounded claims elsewhere. Confirming this had been one woman's personal campaign rather than any broader institutional pattern. Roughly 6 months after the ruling, Cordelia reached out to me personally, not as a board representative, but as a neighbor, asking honestly whether I'd ever consider a limited, properly compensated arrangement for occasional supervised community access to a small portion of my land. I agreed eventually to a modest arrangement, properly recorded with the county, permitting 2 scheduled nature walks a year, well away from the pond, with advance written notice required every time. I want to be clear that arrangement exists because Cordelia asked honestly, rather than because anyone assumed entitlement to land that had never belonged to them. My children still fish at that pond every summer, on ground that has belonged to our family without interruption, for nearly 80 years now across 3 generations. My daughter likes to tell the story herself these days, usually ending it with the detail that the woman who threatened to have her arrested lost her position on the board within the same year. A detail she finds, reasonably enough, rather satisfying. I think about my grandfather sometimes, out at that pond, remembering that he built it with his own 2 hands on ground he bought with almost nothing, believing it would belong to his family permanently regardless of whatever eventually grew up around it. I don't think he could have imagined a woman in an expensive jacket threatening to have his great-grandchildren arrested on ground. He cleared himself. But I like to believe he would have recognized exactly what I was doing, keeping that careful log for 4 years, waiting patiently for the moment when overwhelming documentation would finally settle the matter for good. The same way he once told my father that the only thing that truly protects a piece of land is a man's willingness to defend it properly when the moment finally comes. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether your own family has ever had to defend land that meant more to you than any court document could ever fully capture. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.